Professor Namyong Lee's long-form commentary, Reconstructing the Determinants of Korea's $1 exchange rate through a structural equation framework. The exchange rate is not a single number but the outcome of an underlying structure. The $1 exchange rate may appear to be a price formed in the foreign exchange market, but in reality it is a comprehensive scorecard produced by the entire operating system of the Korean economy. It reflects export and import prices, signals the movement of financial capital, and represents the market's assessment of national risk. Interpreting the exchange rate through isolated events or political rhetoric inevitably leads to policy failure. The exchange rate must be analyzed not by asking why it moved, but by identifying which structure was at work. To explain this systematically, a structural equation framework is applied. In the structural equation model, the dependent variable is the $1 exchange rate. In this analysis, the dependent variable y is the $1 exchange rate. While the log exchange rate, or the rate of change, is often more suitable for empirical analysis than the level itself, the key point is that the exchange rate is an outcome variable. It does not move independently, but is determined by the interaction of multiple factors. Therefore, explaining the exchange rate requires a clear distinction between exogenous variables that drive it and endogenous variables that interact with it simultaneously. Structural equations provide a tool for explaining such policy-relevant causal relationships. Exogenous variables represent the external environment that Korea cannot control. First, the primary exogenous variable is the global dollar cycle. US growth, the inflation trajectory, and expectations about Federal Reserve policy rates determine the direction of the dollar and exert direct pressure on the won. Second is global risk aversion. Financial crises, geopolitical conflicts, and global financial instability sharply increase demand for the dollar. Third are commodity and energy prices. Oil and energy prices affect the exchange rate through Korea's trade balance and import prices. Fourth are geopolitical and international political risks. These variables cannot be controlled by Korea in the short term and are treated as exogenous shocks in the structural equation framework. Endogenous variables are domestic structures that move together with the exchange rate. These variables interact with the exchange rate within the domestic economy. First is the Korea-US interest rate differential and interest rate expectations. Interest rate differentials redirect capital flows and move simultaneously with the exchange rate. Second are capital flows. Foreign investors trading in equities and bonds and banks' foreign currency funding amplify short-term exchange rate volatility. Third is the national risk premium. CDS spreads and sovereign bond yield differentials are immediately reflected in the exchange rate. Fourth are foreign currency liquidity conditions and swap premiums. The microstructure of the foreign exchange market often leads or exaggerates movements in the spot exchange rate. Fifth are the current account balance and the structure of trade. Because these variables are jointly determined with the exchange rate, they must be treated as endogenous. Within the structural equation framework, the exchange rate is the combined outcome of exogenous and endogenous variables. When global dollar strength and risk aversion intensify, the national risk premium rises and capital outflow pressures increase. Capital outflows tighten foreign currency liquidity, which in turn leads to a rise in the exchange rate. At the same time, changes in expectations about interest rate differentials cause the exchange rate and capital flows to reinforce each other. In this process, the exchange rate moves as a result rather than as a cause. Structural equations describe this chain of transmission as a single integrated system. From a relational perspective, the exchange rate is a channel through which forces are transmitted. In relational terms, the exchange rate is not about assigning blame to a specific actor, but about the transmission of power among stakeholders. Global financial markets transmit shocks through the dollar, while domestic financial markets respond through capital flows. Firms absorb exchange rate movements through pricing and investment decisions, and households experience them through inflation and interest rates. Governments and central banks send signals back to markets through policy rates, foreign exchange market stabilization measures, and communication. Structural equations formalize and analyze this network of relationships through mathematical representation. From the perspective of federal enterprise architecture, the exchange rate is an output of multiple functions. Under the FEA framework, the exchange rate is not the result of a single policy, but the combined output of several administrative functions. Monetary policy produces interest rates and liquidity, while fiscal policy produces government bond supply and counter-cyclical signals. Financial stability functions manage leverage and foreign currency borrowing. Foreign exchange market infrastructure functions ensure transaction stability and settlement safety. External economic functions shape trade and the current account, and foreign policy and security functions determine the national risk premium. When these functions are not aligned, the exchange rate becomes unstable almost immediately. Exchange rate stability is a task of continuous management. It cannot be achieved through one-off interventions. At the problem definition stage, structural factors behind exchange rate movements must be distinguished from temporary factors. At the design stage, combinations of interest rate policy, macroprudential measures, and foreign exchange market actions must be formulated. At the pilot stage, market responses and side effects must be assessed. At the diffusion and standardization stage, verified measures must be institutionalized. At the performance management stage, volatility indicators and market confidence must be continuously evaluated. When this continuum is broken, exchange rate policy degenerates into a show. The exchange rate is a test of national resilience. Sharp exchange rate spikes can occur at any time. What matters is not the spike itself, but the speed of recovery and the prevention of recurrence. Structural equations reveal the channels through which shocks are amplified, while the adversity quotient evaluates how quickly those shocks are absorbed. Countries with clear accountability, precise resource allocation, and institutionalized learning emerge stronger after exchange rate shocks. By contrast, when authorities ignore structure and rely solely on short-term stabilization, markets withdraw trust. Policy prescriptions must be aligned with structure. First, to respond to exogenous shocks, messages from monetary, fiscal, financial stability, and foreign policy authorities must be consistently aligned. Second, the interaction between interest rate differentials and capital flows must be managed structurally. Third, bottlenecks in foreign currency liquidity and swap markets must be addressed at the micro level. Fourth, capital flow management is needed to translate current account surpluses into exchange rate stability. Fifth, all measures must be explained with data and evaluated based on performance. The $1 exchange rate is the outcome of Korea's governing capacity. It is not an object of prediction, but an object of structural management. The structural equation framework reveals the pathways of forces that move the exchange rate and clarifies points of policy failure. Korea's path toward advanced economy status does not lie in controlling the exchange rate, but in building a system that remains stable even when the exchange rate fluctuates. This is the correct structural perspective from which to understand the $1 exchange rate. Thank you for watching Professor Namyong Lee's long-form commentary.